The stagecoach rattled over another pothole, and Eleanor Hartwell gripped the wooden seat beneath her. 3 weeks of travel had brought her from Boston to this endless stretch of Montana territory, where the sky seemed too big and the land too empty. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the letter in her pocket, the one she had read so many times the creases threatened to tear through completely. Dear Miss Hartwell, I am a man of modest means but honest work. I seek a wife who values hard work and simple pleasures. If you are willing to build a life together on my ranch, I promise you respect, security, and a home of your own. Thomas Brennan's words had been simple, direct, and exactly what she needed to hear. At 28, Eleanor had watched her younger sisters marry while she cared for their ailing mother. When mother passed last winter, Eleanor found herself alone in a boarding house with $17 to her name and no prospects. The other girls whispered about her behind gloved hands, calling her a spinster, a burden, a woman past her prime. Thomas's letter had arrived through a matrimonial agency like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The driver's shout pulled her from her thoughts. White River Station, miss. End of the line. Eleanor smoothed her travel-stained dress and adjusted her hat, trying to look presentable for the man who would be her husband. She had sent him a photograph taken 2 years ago, and he had sent her one showing a man with kind eyes and sun-weathered skin, standing proud in front of a modest ranch house. Her heart hammered as the coach lurched to a stop in front of a general store that seemed to be the town's main establishment. She stepped down, her legs unsteady after hours of travel, and looked around for Thomas. A small crowd had gathered near the store, their faces grave and their voices hushed. Eleanor approached with her carpetbag, clearing her throat politely. Excuse me, I'm looking for Thomas Brennan. He was supposed to meet me here. The conversation stopped. A woman in a faded calico dress turned to her with wide eyes. An older man with a silver beard removed his hat and twisted it in his hands. The silence stretched too long, filled with something Eleanor couldn't name but felt in her bones. Finally, a man in a black suit stepped forward. He had the look of a shopkeeper or perhaps a banker, someone used to delivering difficult news. You must be Miss Hartwell, he said quietly. Thomas mentioned you were coming. I'm Samuel Piquette, the postmaster and notary. He paused, his face creasing with genuine sadness. Miss Hartwell, I'm afraid I have terrible news. Thomas Brennan passed away 4 days ago. The world tilted. Eleanor's bag slipped from her fingers and hit the dusty ground with a soft thud. Passed away? But his letter was only 6 weeks old. He said he was in good health. He said. Her voice trailed off as the reality crashed over her like a frozen wave. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a dead man. It was his heart, Piquette continued, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. Happened sudden-like while he was mending fence. His hand Miguel found him that evening. The funeral was yesterday. We didn't know how to reach you to tell you not to come. He gestured to the small church visible at the end of the street. He's buried in the cemetery yonder, if you want to pay respects. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of the street, aware of every eye upon her. She had no money for return passage. She knew no one in this territory. The boarding house in Boston had already rented her room to someone else. Behind her, the stagecoach driver was already turning his team around, heading back the way they had come. She watched it disappear into the distance, taking with it her last connection to everything familiar. What am I supposed to do now? The words came out as barely a whisper, but in the quiet street, everyone heard them. The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered and heavy with implications. Eleanor Hartwell had come west to start a new life, and instead found herself stranded in a strange land with nothing but the clothes on her back and a dead man's promises. Eleanor knelt beside the fresh grave as the sun climbed higher in the Montana sky. The wooden cross bore his name in simple carved letters, Thomas Brennan, 1841 to 1887. She had bought wildflowers from a little girl near the general store, spending precious coins she could barely afford to lose. The purple and yellow blooms looked small and inadequate against the mounded earth, but she arranged them anyway with trembling fingers. I don't know what to say to you, she whispered to the grave. We never met, but I read your letter so many times I felt like I knew your voice. You seemed like a good man, Thomas Brennan. I'm sorry I arrived too late. A dry wind swept across the cemetery, stirring dust devils between the markers. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and tried to think practically about her situation, but her mind kept circling back to the same impossible truth. She was alone, broke, and stranded 1,000 miles from anywhere she could call home. Footsteps crunched on the gravel path behind her. Eleanor turned to see Samuel Piquette approaching with another man, younger and weathered, wearing work clothes and a cautious expression. Miss Hartwell, Piquette said, This is Miguel Cortez. He was Thomas's ranch hand and, I'd say, his closest friend these past 5 years. Miguel removed his hat and nodded respectfully. Señorita Hartwell. I am very sorry for this situation. Mr. Thomas, he talked about you often these last weeks. He was happy, excited like a boy. He fixed up the house, bought new curtains, planted flowers by the porch. His English carried a soft accent, and his dark eyes held genuine sympathy. He wanted everything perfect for when you arrived. The kindness in his words broke something inside Eleanor. Tears she had been holding back since stepping off that stagecoach finally spilled over. She covered her face with her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She cried for Thomas, for herself, for the life that had been promised and stolen away before it could even begin. The two men stood quietly, giving her the dignity of her grief. When she finally composed herself, Piquet cleared his throat. Miss Hartwell, we've been discussing your predicament. The town has a small fund for emergencies. We could probably gather enough to send you back east, though it might take a week or two to collect the money. Eleanor wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and looked up at him. And in the meantime? I have $4 left to my name, Mr. Piquet. That won't pay for lodging or meals while I wait. There's Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Piquet offered, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced of this solution. She might extend credit if we vouch for you. Miguel shifted his weight, his hat turning in his hands. There is another possibility, he said slowly. The ranch. Mr. Thomas, he left no family. No will that anyone knows of. The ranch just sits there. Someone needs to care for the animals, maintain the property, or everything he built will fall to nothing. Eleanor stared at him. Are you suggesting I stay at the ranch? The house is empty, Miguel said. There is food in the pantry, chickens for eggs, a milk cow. It would solve the immediate problem of where you stay while decisions are made about what comes next. He looked at Piquet. Is this legal? Can she do this? Piquet stroked his beard thoughtfully. It's irregular. Without a will, the property would normally go through probate and eventually to the territorial government if no heirs are found. But that process takes months. In the meantime, someone needs to maintain the place, and legally speaking, Miss Hartwell did have an agreement with Thomas, even if it couldn't be formalized. He turned to Eleanor. It would be appropriate for you to stay there temporarily. You'd actually be doing the estate a service by keeping the property from falling into disrepair. Eleanor stood, brushing dust from her skirt. Her mind raced through the options. Return east to what? She had nothing there. Here, at least, was a roof and the possibility of time to figure out her next move. Show me the ranch, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to see what I'm walking into. They rode out in Miguel's wagon, following a rutted path that wound through rolling grassland dotted with cattle. The ranch house appeared after 20 minutes, a simple but well-built structure of timber and stone with a covered porch and a stone chimney. Nearby stood a barn, a chicken coop, and a corral where several horses watched their approach with mild interest. Eleanor could see the touches Thomas had made in preparation for her arrival, the new curtains Miguel had mentioned, visible through the windows, a rocking chair on the porch, flower beds freshly planted and now slightly wilted from lack of care. Inside, the house was neat and spare. A main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, 2 bedrooms, and furniture that was simple but sturdy. On the kitchen table lay a stack of papers weighted down by a coffee cup. Eleanor walked over and saw they were notes in Thomas's handwriting. Ask Miguel about garden plot. Fix loose board on porch step. Remember Eleanor arrives June 15th. The last note pierced her heart with its innocent anticipation. This was a good man's home, she said quietly. Miguel nodded. Sigh. He worked hard, treated people fairly. The ranch is small but profitable. 70 head of cattle, good grazing land, water rights to the creek. He owed no debts. Everything here, he earned with his own hands. Eleanor walked through the house, touching the furniture, looking at the simple dishes in the cupboard, the books on the shelf. Outside the window, she could see the vast Montana landscape stretching to distant mountains. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely foreign to everything she had known in Boston. I'll stay, she announced, turning to face the two men. At least for now. I'll take care of the place and figure out what comes next. Piquet nodded approvingly. I think that's wise. I'll make sure word gets around town so there's no gossip about impropriety. Miguel smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. I will come each day to help with the heavy work and teach you what you need to know. You cannot run a ranch alone, señorita, but together we can keep things going. As the two men prepared to leave, Eleanor stood on the porch of what was supposed to have been her marital home and watched the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. She had come here to be a rancher's wife. Through a twist of fate she never could have imagined, she was now the rancher herself, or at least the keeper of one man's dream until the world decided what to do with her. It wasn't the life she had planned, but standing there in the golden light of a Montana evening, Eleanor felt something unexpected stirring inside her. Not quite hope, not yet, but perhaps the seed of possibility. Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing, momentarily confused about where she was. The unfamiliar room slowly came into focus: rough wooden walls, a simple dresser, curtains patterned with tiny blue flowers. Thomas's house. Her house now, at least temporarily. She dressed quickly in her most practical clothes and stepped out into the cool morning air, determined to understand what she had agreed to care for. The ranch was already alive with activity. Miguel was in the barn, and she could hear him talking softly in Spanish to the horses. Eleanor made her way to the chicken coop, remembering her grandmother's farm from childhood visits. The hens clucked and fussed as she gathered eggs in her apron, their warm weight familiar and comforting. At least this part she knew how to do. "You are up early," Miguel called from the barn door. "This is good. Ranch work starts with the sun." He showed her how to milk the cow, his patient hands guiding hers until she found the rhythm. The milk hissed into the bucket in steady streams, and Eleanor felt a small surge of pride at this accomplishment. Boston drawing rooms and piano lessons had not prepared her for this life, but she was learning. Over breakfast of eggs and bread, Miguel outlined the work ahead. "The cattle need checking daily. We ride the property, look for sick animals, broken fences, predators. The horses need exercising. The garden needs watering now that summer comes. There is always mending, cleaning, preparing for winter even though winter seems far away." Eleanor listened, trying not to feel overwhelmed by the enormity of it all. "Thomas managed this alone before you came?" Miguel shook his head. "Señor Thomas worked from before dawn until after dark, every day. Even then, things were sometimes neglected. A ranch this size needs at least 2 people, better 3. He hired me 2 years ago when his health began to trouble him, though he never admitted it troubled him." That afternoon, Miguel taught her to ride. Eleanor had ridden gentle mares in Boston parks, but the sturdy ranch horse was different, responding to confidence and clear commands. They rode out to check the nearest pasture, where cattle grazed peacefully under the vast sky. Miguel pointed out landmarks, explained boundary lines, showed her the creek that watered the property. "This is good land," he said. "Mr. Thomas chose well when he bought this place 8 years ago. Started with nothing, built it all himself." As the days passed, Eleanor fell into the rhythm of ranch life. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached from unfamiliar work. She learned to pump water, chop wood, make bread that didn't come out like a brick. Miguel was patient, teaching her to read the weather, to spot a lame horse, to understand the endless small tasks that kept a ranch running. In the evenings, she sat on the porch and watched the sun paint the mountains purple and gold, too tired to do anything but exist in the moment. The town, however, was less accepting of her presence. When Eleanor rode in with Miguel to buy supplies at the general store, she felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. 2 women deliberately turned away when she tried to greet them. At the counter, the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Peterson, was coldly polite as she tallied Eleanor's purchases. "I suppose you'll be heading back east soon," Mrs. Peterson said, her tone making it clear this was more command than question. "A woman alone on a ranch isn't proper, Miss Hartwell. People talk." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "I'm caring for the property until legal matters are settled, Mrs. Peterson. I'm doing nothing improper, and I don't intend to abandon a ranch that needs tending just because small minds create scandal where none exists." The shopkeeper's wife flushed red, but before she could respond, a voice rang out from behind Eleanor. "Well said, young lady." An older woman stepped forward, elegantly dressed despite the frontier setting, her silver hair pinned perfectly beneath a stylish hat. "I'm Catherine Marshall. My husband owns the largest ranch in the territory, and I've been running the business side of it for 20 years while he pretends he's in charge." She extended a gloved hand to Eleanor. "I heard about your situation. Took courage to stay instead of running back east." Eleanor shook her hand gratefully. "I had nowhere to run back to, Mrs. Marshall." "Even so," Catherine said, "you could have panicked. You chose to stand your ground. That takes backbone." She turned to Mrs. Peterson with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Put Miss Hartwell's purchases on my account, Clara. Consider it a welcoming gift." Before Eleanor could protest, Catherine guided her out of the store and into the street. Don't let the hens peck at you, my dear. Half the women in this town are bored silly and create drama to entertain themselves. The other half are decent people who'll come around once they see you're serious about making a go of it. Over the next week, Catherine visited the ranch twice, bringing practical gifts, seeds for the garden, preserved fruits, a book on cattle ranching. She also brought advice, frank and invaluable. You need to establish yourself legally, she said one afternoon as they sat on the porch. File a claim as Thomas's intended widow. Territory law is murky on such things, but possession is 9/10 of the law out here. If you work the land, improve the property, and no heirs appear, you could have a real case for ownership. Eleanor had been thinking the same thing, but hearing it said aloud made it real and frightening. I barely know how to run a ranch, Mrs. Marshall. How can I claim to deserve ownership? You're learning every day, Catherine replied. I've talked to Miguel. He says you work harder than most men he's known and complain less. You're up before dawn and you don't quit when things get difficult. That's what matters out here, Eleanor. Not where you came from or what you knew before, but what you're willing to become. That evening, Eleanor sat at Thomas's desk with the ranch ledgers spread before her. She had found them in a drawer, months of careful records in Thomas's neat handwriting. Income from cattle sales, expenses for feed and supplies, notes about breeding stock and water rights. It was the documentation of a man building something solid and lasting, one season at a time. At the bottom of the last page, he had written, "Next year, with Eleanor's help, we'll expand the herd and maybe add some chickens for her. She should have her own project, something that's just hers." Eleanor traced the words with her finger, feeling the weight of a dead man's dreams pressing on her shoulders. He had planned a future that included her, had imagined her as a partner in building this life. That future was gone, but the ranch remained, and so did she. She pulled out a fresh page and began her own entry in the ledger. June 22, 1887. Repaired fence in North Pasture. Sold eggs to Mrs. Chen. Began planning fall garden. E. Hartwell, temporary custodian. She paused, then added, or perhaps something more. Time will tell. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July, delivered by Samuel Piquet himself, his face grave. Eleanor was in the garden, her hands deep in soil as she transplanted seedlings. She stood up, brushing dirt from her apron, a sense of dread settling in her stomach at the postmaster's expression. "Miss Hartwell," Piquet said, handing her an official-looking envelope. "This came through territorial channels. You'll want to read it carefully." Eleanor tore it open, her eyes scanning the formal legal language. The words jumped out at her like physical blows: claimed inheritance, nephew in St. Louis, rightful heir, vacate the property within 30 days. She read it twice, then looked up at Piquet. Thomas had family? A nephew? News to me, Piquet said. But the letter's from a lawyer in St. Louis representing a man named Horace Brennan. Claims he's Thomas's brother's son and entitled to the estate. He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I know you've put work into this place." Eleanor's mind raced. 6 weeks she had been here. 6 weeks of dawn to dusk labor, of learning to rope a calf and mend a fence, of blistered hands and aching muscles. She had repaired the barn roof, doctored a sick horse back to health, negotiated a fair price for cattle with a buyer who tried to cheat her. The ranch was thriving under her and Miguel's care, better than it had been in Thomas's last months when his failing heart had slowed his work. "What are my options?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. "Legally? Not many," Piquet admitted. "Blood relation trumps an unconsummated engagement in territorial law. If this Horace Brennan can prove his lineage, he inherits everything." He paused. "But proving it takes time. And if you contest the claim, it takes even more time." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and tucked it in her pocket. "Then I'll contest it. I need you to help me file the paperwork, Mr. Piquet. I'm not leaving without a fight." Catherine Marshall arrived that afternoon, having heard the news through the efficient grapevine of frontier gossip. She found Eleanor in the barn, furiously mucking out stalls with an energy born of anger and fear. "So you've decided to fight," Catherine said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I have to," Eleanor said, driving her pitchfork into the hay. "I have nowhere else to go, but it's more than that. This ranch was Thomas's life work. I never met him, but I've read his journals, seen his careful records, touched everything his hands built. He wanted this place to matter, to be something lasting. I won't let some distant relative who never cared about him when he was alive swoop in and claim it all." Catherine smiled. Good. Because I've been asking around about Horace Brennan. Interesting fellow. He's a clerk in St. Louis, deep in debt from gambling, hasn't spoken to Thomas in over 15 years. There was bad blood between Thomas and Horace's father. They had a falling out before Thomas came west, something about a business deal gone wrong. She pulled a telegram from her purse. I have contacts in St. Louis. Horace only learned about Thomas's death because a lawyer he owes money to saw the notice in a Missouri newspaper that reprints Western obituaries. The moment he heard Thomas had property, he manufactured this inheritance claim. Eleanor leaned on her pitchfork. Can we prove that? Maybe. If we can show he abandoned any relationship with Thomas, if we can demonstrate you have a stronger claim through Thomas's clear intent to marry you, if we can prove you've improved the property and Horace would simply sell it off for quick cash. Catherine's eyes gleamed with the light of battle. It won't be easy, and it's not guaranteed. But I know the territorial judge. He's a pragmatic man who values work over paper claims. If we present the right case, you might win. Over the next weeks, Eleanor worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She documented every improvement to the property, photographed the gardens she had planted, collected testimonials from neighbors about the ranch's condition when she arrived versus now. Miguel proved invaluable, his detailed knowledge of Thomas's struggles and his willingness to testify about Eleanor's dedication giving their case weight. But not everyone supported her. A delegation of townspeople, led by Mrs. Peterson and 2 other churchwomen, visited the ranch one afternoon. Eleanor received them on the porch, her spine straight and head chin up. Miss Hartwell, Mrs. Peterson began, her voice dripping with false concern, we've come to talk sense into you. This fight you're waging, it's unseemly. A proper woman would accept the legal decision and move on. You're making a spectacle of yourself, and it reflects poorly on our community. Eleanor descended the porch steps until she stood eye to eye with the older woman. Mrs. Peterson, I'm not sure where you got the idea that your opinion of my choices matters to me, but let me be clear. I'm fighting for my home and my future. If that makes me improper in your eyes, I'll gladly be improper. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. The women left in a huff, but Eleanor's hands shook as she watched them go. The fight was taking its toll, the constant stress of uncertainty wearing at her like water on stone. That night, alone in the house, she allowed herself a moment of doubt. What if she lost? What if all this effort was for nothing? She found herself standing in front of the small mirror in the bedroom, looking at her reflection. The woman who stared back was not the same woman who had stepped off that stagecoach 7 weeks ago. Her face was tanned, her hands rough, her body stronger. But more than that, her eyes were different. They held determination, fire, a refusal to be broken. She had discovered something in herself during these weeks on the ranch, something she hadn't known existed, the capacity to fight for what was hers. The hearing was set for August 15th. Horace Brennan arrived 3 days early, staying at the hotel in town and making himself visible, shaking hands, buying drinks at the saloon. He was a soft-bodied man with calculating eyes and an ingratiating smile. When Eleanor saw him on the street, he tipped his hat to her with mock politeness. "Cousin Eleanor," he called out, though they shared no relation. "I hope there are no hard feelings. Business is business, after all." Eleanor stopped in front of him, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Mr. Brennan, when did you last speak to your Uncle Thomas?" His smile faltered slightly. "Family matters are private." "The answer is never," Eleanor said. "You never spoke to him. You never wrote to him. You never cared if he lived or died until you learned he had something worth taking. That's not family, Mr. Brennan. That's theft dressed up in legal language." On the morning of the hearing, Eleanor dressed in her best clothes and walked into the makeshift courtroom in the back of the general store with her head high. Miguel, Catherine, and Samuel Paquette sat on her side. Horace Brennan sat with his lawyer on the other. Judge Harold Thornton, a weathered man with sharp eyes, presided over the proceedings with impatient efficiency. Both sides presented their arguments. Brennan's lawyer emphasized bloodline and legal inheritance rights. Eleanor's case, argued eloquently by Catherine who had some legal training from her father, focused on intent, abandonment, and Eleanor's transformation of the property. The judge listened to everything, asked pointed questions, and then called for a recess. Eleanor waited in the street outside, unable to sit still, pacing back and forth while Catherine tried to reassure her. When they were called back in, Judge Thornton delivered his verdict. "This is an unusual case," he began, "but these are unusual times and this is unusual country. We're building something new out here, and I believe our laws should reflect the reality of how life works on the frontier, not just how things were done back east. Judge Thornton surveyed the crowded room with the measured gaze of a man who had seen every trick and scheme the frontier had to offer. Eleanor felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Beside her, Catherine Marshall's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing once for encouragement. "Mr. Horace Brennan," the judge continued, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades on the bench, "you present a blood claim to your uncle's estate. The law is clear that such claims carry weight. However, the law also requires me to consider the totality of circumstances." He picked up a document from his desk. "I've reviewed the evidence showing you had no contact with Thomas Brennan for over 15 years. You did not attend his funeral, though you arrived in town 3 days before this hearing. You made no inquiry about his welfare during his life, sent no letters, offered no assistance when he was establishing his ranch. Your connection to him is biological only, not filial." Horace shifted in his seat, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. The judge raised a hand for silence. "Miss Eleanor Hartwell, you present an unusual claim. You never married Thomas Brennan, never even met him. However, you entered into a good faith agreement with him, traveled 2,000 miles at considerable expense and risk based on his promises, and arrived to fulfill your part of that bargain. The fact that death intervened was not your fault or your choice." Eleanor held her breath. The judge wasn't done. "More significantly, you did not abandon your commitment when faced with his death. You could have demanded money to return east. Instead, you stayed and worked the property. I've heard testimony from Miguel Cortez about the improvements you've made, the illnesses you've treated in the livestock, the repairs you've completed. I've seen the financial records showing the ranch is more profitable now than it was in Thomas's final months. Samuel Piquet testified that you've handled business dealings with honesty and competence. Catherine Marshall, whose judgment I trust implicitly, has vouched for your character and determination." The judge leaned forward, his eyes moving between Eleanor and Horace. "Here's what I believe, based on 30 years of practicing law in frontier territories. Thomas Brennan intended Eleanor Hartwell to be his wife and partner. He made preparations for her arrival, demonstrating his serious commitment. Eleanor Hartwell has demonstrated through her actions that she intended to honor her commitment to him and to the ranch. The question before me is whether a piece of paper and a ceremony are more important than intention and action." He paused, letting the tension build. In the established states, perhaps the answer would be yes. But we're not in the established states. We're building something different out here, where a person's work and character matter more than their pedigree or paperwork. Mr. Brennan, you have a legal claim, but you have no moral one. You see this ranch as money to be extracted. Miss Hartwell sees it as a life to be built. Judge Thornton picked up his gavel. "Therefore, I am ruling that Eleanor Hartwell has established a claim to the property through promissory estoppel and beneficial use. However, I'm also recognizing that Horace Brennan has a competing legal interest through blood inheritance. My compromise is this: Eleanor Hartwell will have the right to purchase the property from the estate at a fair market value to be determined by independent assessment, with 5 years to make payment. Until that payment is complete, she will operate the ranch and Horace Brennan will receive a small percentage of profits as his inheritance. If she defaults, the property reverts to him." The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to split Eleanor's world into before and after. She had won, or at least won enough. The ranch was hers if she could pay for it, and 5 years was enough time to make that happen. Horace Brennan stood up, his face purple with rage, but his lawyer pulled him back down, whispering that this was better than a total loss. Outside the courtroom, Eleanor stood in the summer sun feeling lighter than air. Catherine embraced her, laughing with delight. Miguel grinned and shook her hand with both of his. "You did it, señorita. You beat him." "I didn't beat him entirely," Eleanor corrected, but she was smiling. "I bought time to prove myself. Now comes the hard part, actually succeeding." But even as she said it, she knew she would succeed. She had discovered something about herself in these past months. She was stronger than she had ever imagined, more capable, more resilient. The frightened woman who stepped off that stagecoach had transformed into someone who could stare down town gossips, legal challenges, and her own doubts. The ranch's assessment came in at $800, a fair price that would require careful management and hard work to earn. Eleanor threw herself into that work with renewed purpose. She and Miguel expanded the herd, negotiated better prices for their cattle, began breeding horses to sell to the army fought 2 territories over. She learned to read weather patterns, to judge the quality of hay, to bargain with merchants who assumed a woman could be cheated easily. The seasons turned. The first winter was brutal, testing everything she had learned. Blizzards trapped them for days, and the struggle to keep animals fed and healthy was constant. But Eleanor survived it, came through to spring stronger and more confident. By the second year, the ranch was profitable enough that she made her first payment to the estate. Horace received his percentage check with poor grace, but he cashed it nonetheless. The town's attitude shifted gradually. The women who had shunned her began to nod in greeting. Mrs. Peterson never apologized, but she stopped her active hostility. Some of the younger women, trapped in marriages they hadn't chosen or futures they couldn't control, looked at Eleanor with something like envy. She had seized control of her own destiny in a way few women could. In the third year, Eleanor bought 2 neighboring parcels that came up for sale, expanding the ranch to over 200 acres. She hired 2 more hands to help Miguel, young men who appreciated her fair treatment and decent wages. She became known as a tough but honest employer, someone who expected hard work but rewarded it generously. Catherine Marshall became a close friend, the older woman delighting in Eleanor's success. "You've done more than save a ranch," Catherine told her one evening as they sat on Eleanor's porch watching the sunset. "You've shown every woman in this territory that they can choose their own path. That's worth more than all the cattle in Montana." By the 5th year, Eleanor had saved enough to make the final payment. She rode into town on a crisp October morning, walked into Samuel Piquette's office where he now handled legal matters as well as postal duties, and placed a bank draft on his desk. "That's the last of it," she said. "The ranch is mine, free and clear." Piquette smiled and began preparing the final paperwork. "Thomas would be proud of you, Eleanor. He wanted someone to carry on his dream, to make something lasting out of this land. You've done that and more." He paused. "Have you ever wondered what might have happened if he had lived? If you'd married him as planned?" Eleanor considered the question. "I used to wonder all the time, especially in the beginning. But honestly, Samuel, I think this is how it was meant to be. If Thomas had lived, I would have been a rancher's wife, helping him build his dream. Because he died, I became the rancher myself, building my own dream. I'm sorry I never got to meet him, but I'm not sorry about who I became." On the anniversary of her arrival in Montana, Eleanor stood at Thomas's grave with fresh flowers. 6 years had passed since that terrible day when she stepped off the stagecoach to find her future dead and buried. "Thank you," she whispered to the man she never met. "You brought me here with your letter, your hopes, your plans for a life together. You gave me the chance to become someone I never could have been in Boston. I hope wherever you are, you can see what I've done with that chance." The ranch thrived under her management, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. Eleanor never married, though she had offers. She had learned that she didn't need a husband to build a life worth living. She had her land, her work, her friends, and her freedom. That was more than most people ever got, and she